One day, Jesus was approached by a crowd of people, and one of them asked him, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And let's be honest, this is a question that many of us would want to ask Jesus, right? What is the most important of all the laws, right? If we can't fulfill them all, which is the most important? And perhaps you've heard Jesus' reply before. He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments." Now, on the surface, Jesus' command seems pretty simple, right? Love God and love others. That's all you need to do. But what if I told you that there is more going on here? What if I told you that there's deeper meaning hidden within Jesus' words? Something that will forever change the way you see this most important command. Well, if you'd like to know what that is and understand the greatest commandment like never before, then join me for this episode of Misreading Scripture. Now, before we start, if you're interested in learning more insights that will help you to understand the Bible more clearly and see it with an entirely new set of eyes, then make sure to click the link above and down in the description, where you can download a free book I wrote called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. It's a quick but powerful read that will teach you a whole lot in just a short period of time, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. When Jesus tells us which is the greatest of all the commandments in Scripture, he's not doing so in the best of circumstances. He is surrounded by religious leaders, and they're out to get him. He's just fielded a question from a group called the Sadducees about marriage and the resurrection. And now, Matthew tells us that an expert in the law wants him to pick out what is the most important of all 613 commandments in the Jewish law. Now, the truth is, this wasn't something entirely out of the ordinary for that time. Just as we do today, people of the Jewish faith at that time tried to distinguish between biblical commands that were more important and those that were less important. They actually had terms for this. Mitzvot chamorot referred to heavy commandments. Right? The word chamorot means serious. So of all the commands, these were considered to be the most serious, the most important. On the other hand, mitzvot kalot referred to light commandments. Kalot means lightweight. So these were less important commands, less serious. We actually see Jesus address this directly in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, "Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." He's telling people not to ignore any of these commands, right? Even those that people may tell them are less important. And as Jesus stands before this expert in the law in Matthew 22, he's addressing the same subject. The expert in the law is basically asking him to address this in the extreme. Right? Don't just tell me what is mitzvot chamorot. Don't just tell me what is a more serious commandment. Tell me what is the most important of all the commandments. And as you can imagine, a lot is riding on Jesus' answer. These religious leaders are hoping that his credibility is at stake. And when you realize how Jesus responds, you'll see why his answer is so rich and so perfect. Because when Jesus responds that you should love the Lord with your heart, soul, and strength, and that you should love your neighbor as yourself, he isn't making this up himself, right? He's doing exactly what the expert in the law challenged him to do. He's listing actual commands from the Scripture. You see, when Jesus says to love the Lord with your heart, soul, and strength, he's reciting a passage that would have been recited twice a day, every day, by every Jewish person. Right? It's a passage called the Shema. It would have been one of the very first scriptures that he and every other Jewish child memorized as they grew up, because it was foundational to their relationship with God. And let me help you to see why. In the book of Deuteronomy, the Israelite people are about to cross over into the promised land. But before they do, God will give them the law, the commands that they are to live by, that will identify them as God's people and sustain their relationship with the Lord. And at the very beginning, God says this: "These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I will give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. So Shema, hear, O Israel, The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This is what Jesus is quoting. He's quoting the Shema. And he knows that when he quotes this, the people listening won't just remember this verse, right? This is an expert in the law. He has most, if not all of the Old Testament scriptures memorized. So he doesn't just know this verse. He knows everything surrounding it. He knows what it means, what it implies, how important and foundational it is. But he also knows something that most of us don't know, something that I didn't know for most of my life. He knows what each of these words really means. You see, each one of these words in the statement, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and strength, means something different than what we think it does. For instance, the Hebrew word for love is ahava. But ahava isn't just a feeling, right? In English, that's what love is. It's something you feel. But in Hebrew, ahava always involves action. Love is something you do, right? Or how about the word for heart? For most of us, the heart is the seat of our emotions. It's the place from which our feelings come. We feel love in our hearts. But the Hebrew word for heart, levav, it isn't talking about a place where we store our emotions, right? The heart in Jesus' day was the center of our mind. It's where our thoughts came from. Or how about that word for soul, nefesh? In Hebrew, the soul isn't the spirit that lives inside of your physical body. But the Hebrew word for soul, nefesh, describes your entire life. It's every part of your life, every part of who you are. Or how about the word for strength? Right? The Hebrew word that Jesus would have said here doesn't actually mean strength. The Hebrew word found in the Shema is ma'od. And ma'od is a word that doesn't really have an equivalent in English. It literally means all of your very. The best way to describe it is to say something like all of your oomph. It means every bit of energy you've got. So when Jesus tells us that we are to love God with our heart, soul, and strength, that this is the greatest commandment, he's not saying that we have to just feel a lot of love for God. He's saying that our love is shown through our actions, that our minds, every part of our lives, every ounce of energy has to be devoted to God. But then Jesus does something really interesting. He adds to it. He throws in another scripture. This time he quotes Leviticus 19:8. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, which must have caught the attention of the religious leaders on so many levels. But one thing they certainly would have picked up on was a tactic that they might have even used themselves, a common practice among Jewish teachers at that time called gezerah sheva. It basically means a comparison of equals. This is where they would take two different scripture verses and link them together through a common word that they both shared. And in doing this, they would actually allow each verse to interpret the other. That is what Jesus is doing here. The common word shared by both the Deuteronomy and the Leviticus passage is the word ahava, love. And what he's saying is that you can't truly love the Lord with your lavav, nefesh, and ma'od, your thoughts, your entire life, and every ounce of strength you've got, unless you also love your neighbor as yourself. But there's more. Because when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, that phrase, as yourself, is the Hebrew word kamocha. And this word doesn't just mean to make a connection between the way you love your neighbor and the way you love yourself. Right? The comparison isn't between two types of love. The comparison is between your neighbor and you. Jesus isn't asking us to try to manufacture some sort of love for our neighbor that mirrors the way that we love ourselves. He's asking us to take it even deeper. He's saying, I want you to see your neighbor the way you see yourself. I want you to see you and your neighbor as alike, to realize that you are the same. Because when you realize that, then loving them the same way you love yourself will be a natural thing. And don't forget who he's saying this to. He's saying it to his enemies, these religious leaders who are out to get him. He's saying, you'll never be able to fully love the Lord unless you love people like me. And you'll never be able to truly love me unless you fully love the Lord. The two are connected. It's why Jesus says that the law and the prophets all hang on these two commandments. If you don't have both of these, you have nothing. But here's what makes it even more beautiful. In the end, Jesus doesn't just speak these words, he embodies them. Because when Jesus goes to the cross, he's showing us what it is to love the Lord with our lavav, nefesh, and ma'od, to give his entire life, to surrender every last ounce of his strength in obedience to the Lord and out of love for his neighbor. Because the other beautiful thing that we can't miss is that when Jesus goes to the cross, he doesn't just do so for people in the crowd who love him. He doesn't just do it for his friends. He goes to the cross for the Sadducees. He goes to the cross for the expert in the law. He goes to the cross for everyone who put him on that cross. And he goes to that cross for you and for me. What we see in the greatest commandment, what makes it even more powerful when we understand it fully, is that we see what it looks like to truly love like Jesus, to love the Lord with our heart, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, if you haven't done so already, make sure to download my free book called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. You can find a link up here and down in the description. And if you'd like to see another video that will change the way you see Scripture, click this box right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.